Millionaire CEO finds twins, crying at his wife's grave and turns pale upon hearing some words. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The cold wind swept through the vast green, expanse of Rose Hill Cemetery in Chicago, as Alexander Blackwood stood motionless before the freshly carved gravestone. His expensive black coat did little to shield him from the biting chill, but he barely noticed. The weight pressing against his chest was heavier than any storm. The name etched into the marble, Rebecca Mitchell, felt like a wound reopened, bleeding with regret and sorrow. She had been gone for just a week, yet standing here, it still felt unreal. He had attended the funeral, watched her coffin being lowered into the ground, and yet something in him refused to accept that Rebecca, the woman he had once loved with all his heart, was now just a memory. Alexander was not a man who let emotions control him. As the CEO of a successful real estate empire, he had built his fortune on logic, sharp decision-making, and an unshakable will. But today, none of that mattered. Today he was just a man who had lost something irreplaceable. Their love had started like a dream in the bustling streets of New York. She was an artist, full of passion, life, and dreams that had no boundaries. He was already on his way to becoming a self-made millionaire, his life dictated by deadlines, deals, and numbers. Despite their differences, they had fallen for each other, a whirlwind romance that had defied logic and reason. But love alone was never enough. Their marriage had suffered under the weight of his ambition. Late nights at the office turned into missed anniversaries. Business meetings replaced weekend getaways. The love that once burned brightly between them dimmed with every broken promise. Every unanswered phone call, every lonely night she spent waiting for him to come home. Eventually, she stopped waiting. One day, she walked out of their shared Manhattan apartment, leaving only a note behind. "I loved you, but I couldn't wait forever." That was 5 years ago. He never tried to bring her back, not because he didn't love her, but because he believed he had already lost her. Now standing at her grave, the guilt was suffocating. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "For everything." A muffled sob broke through the silence. Alexander stiffened. He wasn't alone. His eyes scanned the cemetery, his sharp instincts kicking in. A few rows away, near Rebecca's grave, stood two small figures, children no older than 6 or 7. They were dressed in simple jackets, their heads bowed, tiny shoulders trembling. They were crying. A strange sense of déjà vu gripped him. Something about them, about the way they stood there, felt eerily familiar. He took a hesitant step forward, his shoes crunching against the gravel. The boys didn't notice him, too lost in their sorrow. One of them, the slightly taller one, sniffled loudly and placed a single white flower on the grave. "Mom, we miss you," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible in the wind. Alexander stopped breathing. His heart, which had been numb for years, suddenly began to race. "Mom?" His eyes darted between the gravestone and the children. They were calling Rebecca their mother. He felt the world tilt beneath him as he took in their faces. Their delicate features, the high cheekbones, the soft curve of their jawlines, the familiar deep brown eyes that mirrored his own reflection. A strange, terrifying thought gripped him. It wasn't possible. Alexander's knees felt weak as he forced himself to speak. I knew your mother," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. The boys exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from fear to curiosity. The younger one wiped his nose on the sleeve. "Are you Mommy's friend?" he asked, his voice filled with innocence. Alexander's chest tightened. How was he supposed to answer that? He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell them that he had loved their mother more than anything, that he had once dreamed of a future with her. But life had pulled them apart. He wanted to tell them that he had no idea they existed, that if he had known, nothing in the world would have kept him away from them. But all those words got stuck in his throat. Instead, he nodded slowly. The older boy narrowed his eyes. "Why didn't you come to her funeral?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. Alexander swallowed hard. He had been at the funeral, standing in the back, watching from a distance. He had felt like an outsider, like someone who had no right to mourn her after abandoning her all those years ago. But now, standing here looking at these two boys who carried his blood, his DNA, he realized just how much he had lost. A painful silence stretched between them, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the trees. Before he could think of what to say, an elderly woman rushed towards them, her face filled with concern. "Ethan, Oliver, what did I tell you about talking to strangers?" she scolded gently, wrapping her arms around the boys protectively. Alexander's head snapped up. Ethan, Oliver. Their names rang in his ears like an echo from a life he had never known. The boys shrank slightly under the woman's gaze but didn't move away. "He knew, Mommy," Oliver murmured. The woman's eyes finally met Alexander's, and in that instant he saw the recognition flicker across her face. She knew who he was. More than that, she knew what he was to them. Her expression hardened, her body tensing as if preparing for a battle. "You need to leave," she said firmly. Alexander's jaw clenched. He had spent his entire life negotiating billion-dollar deals, bending powerful men to his will. But in this moment, he felt utterly powerless. He wasn't ready to leave. He needed answers. He needed to know his sons. But before he could say another word, the woman turned away, leading the boys toward the exit. He stood there, frozen, as his children disappeared from sight. Alexander stood, motionless in the empty cemetery, his heart pounding as the boys and the elderly woman disappeared through the rusted iron gates of Rose Hill Cemetery. The chilling wind blew against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, flooded with a million questions, each one more painful than the last. How could Rebecca have kept this from him? Why hadn't she told him she was pregnant when she left? Did she hate him that much? Or had she simply believed he wouldn't care? His hands clenched into fists as frustration and regret twisted inside him. For years he had lived under the assumption that he and Rebecca had nothing left between them. But now he knew that wasn't true. She had been carrying his children, his sons, and she never gave him the chance to be their father. Alexander's gaze fell back to the grave, the fresh soil covering Rebecca's coffin still damp from last week's rain. She had taken the truth with her, leaving him in the dark, forcing him to discover the existence of Ethan and Oliver in the most heartbreaking way possible. He thought about their small faces, the way they clutched each other's hands as they cried at their mother's grave. They had no idea who he was. To them, he was just another stranger. A lump formed in his throat. He had spent years building a business empire, sealing billion-dollar deals, climbing to the top of the corporate world. But what had it all been for? He had sacrificed so much, his time, his relationships, his love for Rebecca. And for what? To end up standing in a cemetery, realizing too late that he had lost something far more valuable than money. He turned away from the grave, his mind already made up. He needed to find them. He needed to know them. But more than that, he needed them to know him. The next morning, Alexander sat in his office on the 43rd floor of the Willis Tower, staring at his laptop screen. His assistant, Karen, had always been efficient, and today was no exception. Within hours of his request, she had gathered everything there was to know about Rebecca's life after she left him. What he saw made his stomach tighten with guilt. She had moved to Chicago 5 years ago, just a few months after their separation. There was no record of her remarrying, no evidence of another man in her life. She had lived modestly, working as a freelance artist, selling her paintings at small galleries and local art fairs. And then 4 months ago she was diagnosed with late-stage cancer, a slow, cruel disease that had taken her life piece by piece while he had been living in his penthouse in Manhattan, oblivious to her suffering. His eyes skimmed through the documents until they landed on the name of her closest contact, Martha Reynolds, the same woman he had seen with the boys at the cemetery, a retired schoolteacher, aged 67. She had lived in Chicago her entire life. The report confirmed what he had already suspected. Martha had been caring for Ethan and Oliver since Rebecca's passing. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. So this was the woman standing between him and his children. That evening, Alexander found himself parked in front of a modest brick house in Lincoln Park. The house was small, but well-maintained, with flower pots lining the porch and warm yellow lights glowing from the windows. He sat in his car for a long moment, wondering how he was supposed to do this. He had spent his entire life making tough negotiations, convincing investors to trust him with millions of dollars. But this was different. He wasn't just trying to win a deal, he was trying to win back something he had unknowingly lost. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of the car and walked to the front door. He knocked twice, the sound echoing through the quiet evening. A few seconds later, the door opened slightly, and Martha's weary eyes met his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Then, with a resigned sigh, she opened the door wider and stepped aside. "I figured you'd come," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Come in." Alexander stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the cozy living room. A few framed pictures sat on a wooden table near the couch, photos of Ethan and Oliver at various ages. His chest tightened. He had missed everything. Their first steps, their first words, their birthdays. He turned back to Martha, his voice steady but filled with unspoken emotion. "Why didn't she tell me?" Martha sighed and gestured for him to sit. He hesitated before lowering himself onto the couch. "Because she was afraid," she said softly. "Afraid you were too caught up in your world to care. She loved you, Alexander, but she knew the kind of life you lived. She didn't think you'd want to be a father." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. She didn't think he'd want them. His fingers curled into fists. "That's not fair," he said, his voice rough. "She made that decision for me. She took away my right to know them." Martha nodded slowly. "Maybe she did. But can you honestly say she was wrong? Where were you all these years, Alexander? Did you ever try to find her? Did you ever wonder if she was okay?" He opened his mouth to argue, but the words wouldn't come. Because she was right. He had assumed Rebecca had moved on, that she had found happiness somewhere else, and he had done nothing to change that assumption. The realization was like a knife to his heart. Martha studied him for a long moment. "Look," she said finally, her voice softer now. "I don't doubt that you're their father, and I don't doubt that you regret not being there. But those boys, they don't know you. They've just lost their mother. They need stability, not a stranger suddenly claiming to be their dad." Alexander inhaled sharply. "Then let me get to know them." His voice was quieter now, almost pleading. "I don't want to take them away from you, but I want to be in their lives. I need to be in their lives." Martha sighed, her gaze searching his. "I don't know if that's a good idea." He leaned forward, his eyes locked on hers. "Please," he whispered, "just give me a chance." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Martha looked away, exhaling deeply. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's the best I can offer." It wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was a start. Alexander left Martha's house with a storm of emotions brewing inside him. The night air was cold, the streets of Lincoln Park quiet except for the distant hum of traffic. He sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel, his mind replaying every word Martha had said. She had agreed to think about letting him see Ethan and Oliver, but what did that really mean? Would she ever truly trust him enough? He couldn't blame her for being cautious. He was a stranger to them, a man who had unknowingly abandoned his own children. His stomach twisted at the thought. How many times had Rebecca watched their sons grow, knowing that their father had no idea they even existed? Did she ever try to reach out, only to stop, herself? Or had she been too convinced that he wouldn't care? The more he thought about it, the heavier the guilt became. The next morning, Alexander found himself back at work, but his usual focus was gone. The financial reports, the pending mergers, none of it seemed to matter anymore. For the first time in years, he wasn't consumed by the empire he had built. Instead, he was consumed by the thought of two little boys who shared his blood but not his life. He tried to imagine them in their daily routine. Did they have a favorite TV show? What kind of toys did they play with? Were they picky eaters like he had been as a kid? The questions were endless, and the fact that he had no answers made him feel like an outsider in his own family. By midday, he couldn't take it anymore. He picked up his phone and dialed Martha's number. She answered after the third ring, her voice weary. "Alexander, I need to see them," he said without hesitation. "I don't care how, I just need a chance." There was silence on the other end, and for a moment, he thought she would refuse. Then she let out a sigh. "They don't know about you," she said. "I can't just tell them overnight that they have a father they never met." "I understand," he said quickly. "But let me be around, even if I have to be introduced as a friend at first. I just want to know them." Another pause. Then, to his surprise, Martha said, "Meet us at the park tomorrow afternoon. Millennium Park, by the Cloud Gate. We go there often." His breath caught. This was it. His chance. "Thank you," he said, the words barely enough to express what he felt. The next day, Alexander arrived early, dressed in casual jeans and a sweater, an unusual sight for a man always in tailored suits. He stood near the massive silver structure, known as the Bean, scanning the crowd. When he finally spotted them, his heart pounded. Ethan and Oliver were running ahead, their little faces filled with excitement. They looked so much like Rebecca. Their dark hair, the way they moved, it was all her. Martha walked behind them, keeping a close watch, but when she saw him, she gave a small nod, acknowledging his presence. Alexander forced himself to stay, calm as he approached. The boys were tossing a small football between them, laughing as they played. When the ball rolled toward him, he instinctively picked it up. Oliver, the smaller of the two, ran over. "Thanks," he said cheerfully, taking the ball from his hands. Alexander smiled, his chest tightening. "You've got a good throw," he said casually. Oliver grinned. "Ethan's better. He throws it really far." Alexander glanced at Ethan, who was watching, cautiously from a few feet away. There was curiosity in his eyes, but also hesitation. He knew this was the moment to tread carefully. "You both look like future quarterbacks," he said lightly. "Mind if I play for a bit?" Oliver nodded enthusiastically, and after a brief hesitation, Ethan shrugged. "Sure, I guess." For the next half hour, Alexander played catch with them, laughing, as they ran circles around him. It was surreal. These were his sons, and yet they had no idea. Martha watched from a bench nearby, her expression unreadable. After a while, the boys grew tired and plopped onto the grass. Alexander sat beside them, still catching his breath. "So do you guys come here a lot?" he asked. "Yeah," Ethan said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Mom used to bring us here. She said it was her favorite place in the city." Alexander's throat tightened. Rebecca had brought them here. The thought made his chest ache. "She had good taste," he said softly. Oliver looked up at him. "Are you friends with Grandma?" He hesitated, then glanced at Martha, who was listening closely. "Something like that," he said carefully. "I knew your mom a long time ago." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Really?" Alexander nodded, his heart pounding. "Yeah, she was amazing." A silence stretched between them before Ethan said quietly, "I miss her." Alexander's heart broke. He wanted to pull them both into his arms and tell them the truth. Tell them that he missed her too, that they weren't alone. But it was too soon. He had to earn their trust first. "She loved you both very much," he said instead. Oliver sighed, playing with the grass. "Yeah, she used to tell us stories at bedtime. I wish she was still here." Alexander swallowed hard. He couldn't change the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could be there for them now. As the sun began to set, Martha stood up. "Time to go, boys." They groaned in protest, but eventually got up. Oliver turned to Alexander. "Are you coming again?" Alexander looked at Martha, his heart in his throat. She studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod. "We'll see," she said. It wasn't a promise, but it was something. The meetings continued over the next few weeks. Alexander found excuses to see the boys, joining them at the park, watching their soccer games, even taking them for ice cream once with Martha's reluctant permission. Slowly, carefully, he was building a relationship with them, though they still had no idea who he really was. Ethan remained reserved, but his initial suspicion seemed to be fading. Oliver, on the other hand, had taken to Alexander almost immediately, always excited to see him, always full of stories to share. One sunny Saturday, Alexander took them to the Field Museum after getting Martha's approval. Oliver excitedly dragged him from exhibit to exhibit, while Ethan followed at a more measured pace, observing everything with quiet curiosity. They had just finished looking at the dinosaur fossils when Oliver turned to him and asked, "Why don't you have kids?" The question caught Alexander off guard. He glanced at Ethan, who was watching him intently, waiting for an answer. He took a deep breath. "Actually, I do." Oliver's eyes widened. "Really? Where are they?" Alexander hesitated, his heart pounding. This was it. "You're looking at them." There was a long silence. Ethan's face remained unreadable, but Oliver frowned in confusion. "What do you mean?" Alexander swallowed hard. "I mean, I'm your father." Oliver blinked. "Like, our real dad?" "Yes," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know about you for a long time, but when I found out, I wanted to be here. I wanted to know you." Oliver looked stunned, his little mind trying to process the revelation. "But Ethan's face darkened. He clenched his fists, his body tensing as he took a step back. "You're lying," he said, his voice sharp. Alexander's chest ached. "I'm not lying, Ethan. I wish I had known sooner. I wish I had been there." Ethan shook his head, his eyes filled with something that looked dangerously close to betrayal. "You weren't there," he snapped. "You weren't there for Mom. You weren't there for us. And now you just show up and expect us to believe you?" Oliver looked between them, his excitement replaced by confusion. "Ethan, no, we don't need him," Ethan said, his voice shaking. Alexander's throat tightened. "Ethan, I know I made mistakes. You don't know anything," Ethan shouted, his eyes welling up with angry tears. "You don't know what it was like. You don't know what Mom went through. You don't know how hard it was." He turned and ran, pushing past a group of museum visitors. "Ethan," Oliver called after him. Alexander felt frozen, his heart shattering into 1,000 pieces. He had expected anger. He had expected confusion, but he hadn't expected this deep, raw pain. Martha had been right. Hiding the truth wouldn't have helped. But now that it was out, he didn't know how to fix the damage. Oliver grabbed his hand, looking up at him with wide eyes. "We have to find him," he said urgently. Alexander snapped out of his daze and nodded. "Let's go." Alexander's heart pounded as he rushed through the crowded halls of the Field Museum, scanning the faces of tourists and families, desperate to catch a glimpse of Ethan. Oliver clung to his hand, his small fingers trembling. The boy's eyes were wide with panic, darting around the exhibits as they weaved through the crowd. Alexander felt a lump in his throat. He had known telling the truth would be difficult, but he hadn't expected Ethan to run. The pain in his son's voice still echoed in his ears. The anger, the betrayal. He had spent years building his fortune, making deals, growing his empire. Yet here he was, completely helpless when it came to the only thing that truly mattered. They reached the main entrance, and Alexander turned to Oliver, crouching to his level. "Oliver, think. Where would Ethan go?" His voice was calm, but inside he was drowning in fear. Oliver bit his lip, his brows furrowed in thought. When he's mad, he likes to be alone. He doesn't like people looking at him when he's upset. He paused, Then his eyes brightened. The garden's outside by the fountain. That's where he always hides when he's sad. Alexander didn't waste a second. He grabbed Oliver's hand and ran toward the exit, his pulse pounding in his ears. As they stepped outside, the chilly Chicago air hit them, but Alexander barely noticed. His eyes darted around the vast museum grounds past groups of visitors and street performers. Then he saw him. Ethan was sitting on the edge of the fountain, his head buried in his arms, his small shoulders shaking. Alexander's chest tightened at the sight. The boy was so young, yet the weight he carried was too heavy for someone his age. Oliver let go of Alexander's hand and ran ahead. "Ethan," he called. Ethan flinched but didn't look up. Oliver climbed onto the fountain's edge and sat beside him. "You scared me," he said, nudging Ethan's arm. "Why'd you run?" Ethan sniffed, rubbing his face roughly before looking up. His eyes were red, his cheeks streaked with tears. When he saw Alexander approaching, his expression hardened again. "I don't want to talk," he muttered. Alexander slowed his steps, not wanting to push too hard. He had to be careful now. He had already lost too much time with them. He couldn't afford to lose any more. He crouched a few feet away, keeping his voice gentle. "Ethan, I know you're angry, and you have every right to be. I won't force you to. Listen, but I want you to know that I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's jaw clenched. He stared at the water, his fingers gripping the edge of the stone fountain. "You weren't there when we needed you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mom cried so much, she worked so hard, she never talked about you, but I know you hurt her." Alexander felt like he had been punched in the gut. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he hadn't known, that he had never abandoned them on purpose. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was Ethan's pain. He took a deep breath. "You're right," he admitted. "I wasn't there, and nothing I say can change that. But if I had known, I swear to you, I would have been there every single day." Ethan's fingers tightened, his small body rigid. He wanted to believe him, Alexander, could see it in his eyes. But the walls around his heart were high, built from years of disappointment. Oliver shifted closer to his brother, his voice hesitant. "Ethan, maybe he's telling the truth." Ethan shook his head. "It doesn't change anything," he muttered. "Mom's gone." His voice cracked on the last word, and Alexander's own heart shattered. He took a deep breath. "I know it doesn't change the past, but I want to be here now. Not just for a few days, forever." Ethan finally looked at him, his eyes filled with a storm of emotions. "Why now?" he asked. "Why do you care all of a sudden?" Alexander swallowed hard. "Because I love you," he said simply. "I didn't know I had you, but the moment I found out, I couldn't think about anything else. I can't get back the years we lost, but I don't want to lose anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and raw. Oliver looked from Alexander to Ethan, his little face filled with hope, but Ethan was still guarded. He wiped his face again, then let out a deep breath. "I don't know how to feel about this," he admitted. "It's too much." Alexander nodded. "I understand. Take your time. I'll wait." Ethan hesitated, then finally gave a small nod. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. It was something in between, a fragile thread of possibility. And for now, Alexander would take it. Oliver let out a breath he had been holding and hopped off the fountain. "Can we go get ice cream now?" he asked, breaking the tension. Ethan let out a small laugh, barely there, but Alexander caught it. "You always want ice cream," he muttered. Oliver grinned. "Because it makes everything better." Alexander stood and held out a hand. "Come on," he said. "My treat." Ethan hesitated again, but slowly reached for Oliver's hand. Together, they walked toward the street, the weight between them a little lighter than before. It was a small step, but for Alexander it meant everything. The drive back to Martha's house was filled with an odd silence. It wasn't the tense, suffocating silence from before, but something different. a silence that carried uncertainty, hesitation, and perhaps just a sliver of hope. Oliver sat in the back, happily licking at his chocolate ice cream, completely oblivious to the emotional battlefield Alexander and Ethan were navigating. Ethan, on the other hand, sat stiffly, his half-eaten cone melting in his fingers. He stared out the window, his expression unreadable, his mind undoubtedly a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Alexander stole glances at him in the rearview mirror, his heart aching at the sight of his son wrestling with feelings he wasn't ready to express. The Chicago skyline loomed ahead, glittering, against the early evening sky. Alexander had spent years conquering the city, making a name for himself in boardrooms and luxury hotels. Yet he had never felt as unsure as he did now. He had always been a man who thrived on control, on knowing his next move. But with Ethan, there was no roadmap, no strategy that could guarantee success. He could only hope that time and patience would help mend the damage of lost years. When they arrived at Martha's house, she was waiting on the porch, her face drawn with worry. She had called her after they found Ethan, but the brief conversation hadn't eased her concern. As the boys stepped out of the car, Martha rushed to Ethan, checking him over as if searching for visible wounds. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle. Ethan nodded but didn't meet her eyes. "I'm fine." Martha looked at Alexander over Ethan's head, her expression a mix of accusation and resignation. She had warned him about this, about the pain that would come with the truth. But she had also known it was inevitable. "Why don't you boys go inside?" she said softly. "I need to talk to Alexander." Oliver hesitated, looking between the adults, but Ethan grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the house. As they disappeared through the door, Martha turned to Alexander, her arms crossed. "That went well," she said, her voice heavy with sarcasm. Alexander sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know it was rough, but at least now they know. We can move forward from here." Martha's expression softened slightly. "And what does moving forward look like to you?" He met her gaze, unwavering. "I want to be in their lives, properly. Not just as some friend who visits occasionally." She studied him for a long moment as if trying to peer into his soul. "Are you sure? Because those boys have been through enough. They've lost their mother. They can't lose you too." "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere, Martha, I promise." She let out a long breath, then nodded slowly. "We'll need to take it slow, especially with Ethan. He's had a harder time with Rebecca's death. He was always more sensitive." Alexander nodded, already mentally rearranging his life to accommodate his sons. Whatever they need, whatever it takes. As he drove away from Martha's house that night, he felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and hope. The day had been an emotional roller coaster, but underneath all the pain and confusion, there was a sense that somehow they would find their way through this. Together. The days slowly turned into weeks as Alexander navigated his new role as a father. He reduced his work hours, delegated more responsibilities to his team, and spent every free moment learning about his sons, their likes, dislikes, fears, and dreams. Oliver made it easy. He was naturally open, eager to share everything from his favorite superhero to the latest argument he'd had with his friend at school. He bombarded Alexander with questions about his life, his work, and even asked if they could visit his office someday. The boy had accepted Alexander with the pure, unquestioning love that only a child could offer. Ethan, however, remained a challenge. Though he no longer ran away or openly rejected Alexander's presence, he kept his distance. His answers were short, his smiles rare. He watched Alexander from behind an invisible wall, as if constantly waiting for him to reveal his true intentions. Martha had been an unexpected ally. After their initial confrontation, she had begun to see the genuine effort Alexander was making. She shared stories about the boy's childhood, showed him photo albums, and guided him through the complex terrain of parenthood. It wasn't the co-parenting relationship he had imagined, but it was working. One evening, Alexander received a call from Martha that made his heart race. Ethan's refusing to eat, she said, her voice tired. He's been like this since he got home, from school. He won't talk to me or Oliver, I thought. Maybe you could try. Alexander didn't hesitate. I'll be right there. When he arrived, Martha led him to Ethan's room. The boy was sitting on his bed, knees pulled up to his chest, staring at the wall. Alexander knocked gently on the open door. "Hey," he said softly. Ethan glanced at him but said nothing. Alexander entered slowly and sat on the edge of the bed, keeping a respectful distance. "Not hungry?" Ethan shrugged. "Want to talk about it?" Another shrug. Alexander nodded, not pushing. Instead, he looked around the room, taking in the space that his son called home. Soccer trophies lined a shelf, drawings covered the walls, and a small telescope sat by the window. He remembered Martha mentioning that Ethan loved astronomy. "You know," Alexander said casually, "when I was about your age, I used to skip dinner too." This caught Ethan's attention. He looked up, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "My parents thought I was being difficult," Alexander continued. "But the truth was I was trying to save up to buy a telescope. I thought if I ate less, they would spend less on food and somehow that money would magically appear in my savings jar." He laughed softly at the memory. A ghost of a smile touched Ethan's lips before quickly disappearing. "That's stupid." "Yeah, it was," Alexander agreed. "Took me 2 weeks to realize it wasn't working. By then I was so hungry I ate an entire pizza by myself." There was a moment of silence before Ethan spoke again, his voice small. "Did you ever get the telescope?" Alexander nodded. "Eventually. Saved up my allowance for 6 months. Mine was my mom's," Ethan said quietly, glancing at the telescope by the window. "She bought it for my 10th birthday, even though..." He trailed off. "Even though what?" Alexander prompted gently. Ethan swallowed hard. "Even though the doctor had just told her she was sick. She spent her medicine money on it." His voice cracked slightly. Alexander felt his heart constrict. The image of Rebecca sacrificing her own well-being for their son's happiness was both beautiful and devastating. "She must have really loved seeing you happy," he said softly. Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening. "Today at school they asked us to write about our hero," he said, his voice barely audible. "Everyone was writing about their parents. Both of them. Ah. There it was, the source of the pain." "And you wrote about your mom," Alexander guessed. "Yeah." Ethan wiped his nose with his sleeve. "But Ms. Johnson asked why I didn't write about both parents, and Tommy Garcia laughed and said it's because I don't have a dad." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken hurt. Alexander's first instinct was to pull Ethan into his arms, to shield him from the cruelty of thoughtless words, but he knew Ethan wasn't ready for that. Instead, he said quietly, "You do have a dad, Ethan. I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan looked up at Alexander, his young face a battlefield of emotions, hope warring with doubt, the desire to believe fighting against years of disappointment. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, turning away. "You say that now," he muttered finally. "I mean it," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "I know you have no reason to believe me yet, but I'm going to prove it to you, every day, for as long as it takes." Ethan didn't respond, but something in his posture softened slightly. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "So," Alexander said, changing tactics, "think you might be hungry after all?" After a moment's hesitation, Ethan nodded. Together they walked to the kitchen where Martha was putting away leftovers. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw them, both, but she quickly recovered, pulling out plates without comment. As they ate dinner, Alexander noticed that while Ethan still wasn't talking much, he was listening. When Oliver chatted excitedly about a science project or Martha mentioned an upcoming school event, Ethan would glance at Alexander, watching his reactions, as if trying to gauge his level of interest in their lives. The next few weeks brought small incremental changes. Alexander took the boys to a baseball game, helped with homework over video calls, and made it a point to attend every soccer practice he could. Oliver reveled in the attention, but it was Ethan's gradual thawing that gave Alexander hope, until one Tuesday afternoon when everything threatened to unravel. Alexander was in a meeting when his phone buzzed with a text from Martha. "Ethan's missing, not at school pickup. Oliver says they fought at lunch. His blood ran cold. He didn't bother excusing himself, just grabbed his coat and ran. The 30-minute drive to the school took him 18, running every red light, his heart pounding in his ears." Martha was waiting in the parking lot, her face drawn with worry. "I've called everyone, checked all his usual places," she said as soon as Alexander approached. "Nothing." "What was the fight about?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice level despite the panic rising in his throat. Oliver said some kids were teasing them about you, about suddenly having a rich dad. Ethan got angry, told Oliver to stop pretending everything was perfect. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, guilt washing over him. Even now, his presence in their lives was causing pain. "I think I know where he might be," he said suddenly, remembering something from weeks ago. "The fountain at the museum." They split, up to search, Martha taking Oliver to check local parks while Alexander headed downtown. The traffic was merciless, each red light an eternity. By the time he reached the museum, dusk was settling over the city, casting long shadows across the grounds. The fountain area was nearly empty, just a few tourists taking photos of the fading light on the water. No sign of Ethan. Alexander's hope plummeted, replaced by a gnawing fear. Where else could he be? Then he spotted him, not by the fountain but sitting on a bench near the lake, a small figure hunched against the growing cold, a backpack clutched to his chest. Ethan looked up at Alexander, his young face a battlefield of emotions, hope warring with doubt, the desire to believe fighting against years of disappointment. He opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again, turning away. "You say that now," he muttered finally. "I mean it," Alexander replied, his voice steady. "I know you have no reason to believe me yet, but I'm going to prove it to you, every day for as long as it takes." Ethan didn't respond, but something in his posture softened slightly. It wasn't acceptance, but it was a crack in the wall he had built around himself. "So," Alexander said, changing tactics, "think you might be hungry after all?" After a moment's hesitation, Ethan nodded. Together they walked to the kitchen where Martha was putting away leftovers. Her eyes widened in surprise when she saw them both, but she quickly recovered, pulling out plates without comment. As they ate dinner, Alexander noticed that while Ethan still wasn't talking much, he was listening. When Oliver chatted excitedly about a science project or Martha mentioned an upcoming school event, Ethan would glance at Alexander, watching his reactions, as if trying to gauge his level of interest in their lives. The next few weeks brought small, incremental changes. Alexander took the boys to a baseball game, helped with homework over video calls, and made it a point to attend every soccer practice he could. Oliver reveled in the attention, but it was Ethan's gradual thawing that gave Alexander hope, until one Tuesday afternoon when everything threatened to unravel. Alexander was in a meeting when his phone buzzed with a text from Martha. "Ethan's missing. Not at school pickup. Oliver says they fought at lunch." His blood ran cold. He didn't bother excusing himself, just grabbed his coat and ran. The 30-minute drive to the school took him 18, running every red light, his heart pounding in his ears. Martha was waiting in the parking lot, her face drawn with worry. "I've called everyone, checked all his usual places," she said as soon as Alexander approached. "Nothing." "What was the fight about?" Alexander asked, trying to keep his voice level despite the panic rising in his throat. Oliver said some kids were teasing them about you, about suddenly having a rich dad. Ethan got angry, told Oliver to stop pretending everything was perfect. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, guilt washing over him. Even now, his presence in their lives was causing pain. I think I know where he might be, he said suddenly, remembering something from weeks ago. The fountain at the museum. They split, up to search, Martha taking Oliver to check local parks while Alexander headed downtown. The traffic was merciless, each red light an eternity. By the time he reached the museum, dusk was settling over the city, casting long shadows across the grounds. The fountain area was nearly empty. Just a few tourists taking photos of the fading light on the water. No sign of Ethan. Alexander's hope plummeted, replaced by a gnawing fear. Where else could he be? Then he spotted him. Not by the fountain, but sitting on a bench near the lake. A small figure hunched against the growing cold, a backpack clutched to his chest. Relief flooded Alexander so intensely he nearly staggered. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the boy or send him running again. "This seat taken?" he asked quietly, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. Ethan looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "How did you find me?" "I remembered you. Like it here," Alexander said simply, sitting down. "Your mom brought you here." Ethan nodded, looking out at the water. "She used to say the lake was like life, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy, but always beautiful if you looked hard enough." Alexander smiled sadly. She was a wise woman. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the gentle waves lapping against the shore. "Were you planning to come back?" Alexander finally asked, nodding toward the backpack. Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. I just needed to get away." "From what?" "From everything," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. "From Oliver being so happy all the time, from you trying so hard, from people at school asking questions. I just want things to be normal again, but they can't be, can they? Mom's never coming back, and you're here now, and everything's different." The raw honesty in his voice broke Alexander's heart. He resisted the urge to pull Ethan into his arms to promise him that everything would be okay. Instead, he offered the truth. "No," he said softly. "Things can't be the way they were, but that doesn't mean they can't be good again, just in a different way." Relief flooded Alexander so intensely he nearly staggered. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle the boy or send him running again. "This seat taken?" he asked quietly, gesturing to the empty space on the bench. Ethan looked up, surprised but not alarmed. "How did you find me?" "I remembered you. Like it here," Alexander said simply, sitting down. "Your mom brought you here." Ethan nodded, looking out at the water. "She used to say the lake was like life, sometimes calm, sometimes stormy, but always beautiful if you looked hard enough." Alexander smiled sadly. She was a wise woman. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the gentle waves lapping against the shore. "Were you planning to come back?" Alexander finally asked, nodding toward the backpack. Ethan shrugged. "I don't know. I just needed to get away." "From what?" "From everything," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly. "From Oliver being so happy all the time, from you trying so hard, from people at school asking questions. I just want things to be normal again, but they can't be, can they? Mom's never coming back, and you're here now, and everything's different." The raw honesty in his voice broke Alexander's heart. He resisted the urge to pull Ethan into his arms to promise him that everything would be okay. Instead, he offered the truth. "No," he said softly. "Things can't be the way they were, but that doesn't mean they can't be good again, just in a different way." Ethan stared at the water, his young face thoughtful. "Did you really love her?" he asked suddenly. Alexander took a deep breath, memories washing over him like the waves on the shore. "Yes," he said softly. "Very much." "Then why did you leave her?" The question pierced Alexander's heart. He could have given a simplified answer, something easier for a child to understand. But Ethan deserved the truth. "I didn't leave her," he said. "She left me, and she had every right to." He paused, gathering his thoughts. I was so focused on building my business, on being successful, that I forgot what really mattered. I missed dinners, birthdays, anniversaries. I was there physically, but my mind was always somewhere else. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore. Ethan processed this, his brow furrowed. So you didn't know about us, about me and Oliver? No, Alexander said, the word heavy with regret. If I had known, I would have been there. I would have changed everything. Ethan picked at a loose thread on his jacket. Mom used to look at old pictures sometimes. When she thought we were asleep, she'd cry. Alexander closed his eyes briefly, the image too painful to bear. I'm sorry, he whispered. She wasn't always sad, Ethan continued, as if needing Alexander to understand. She'd laugh a lot, especially when Oliver did something silly. And she never missed our games, even when she was really sick. Alexander smiled sadly. She sounds like an amazing mother. She was, Ethan said softly. Then after a pause, she kept your pictures. Alexander looked at him, surprised. She did? Ethan nodded. In a box under her bed. I found them once. She didn't know I saw. The revelation hit Alexander with unexpected force. All these years, he had assumed Rebecca had erased him completely from her life. But she had kept remnants. Memories of what they once had, I think. Ethan hesitated, choosing his words carefully. I think maybe she still loved you too. Alexander's throat tightened with emotion. He didn't trust himself to speak. They sat in silence for a while, the city lights beginning to reflect on the water as darkness fell. Finally, Alexander checked his watch. We should get back. Martha and Oliver are worried sick. Ethan nodded, standing up. As they walked to the car, he didn't pull away when Alexander placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. The drive back was quiet, but not uncomfortable. Ethan stared out the window, lost in thought. When they were almost at Martha's house, he spoke. I don't hate you, he said quietly. I thought I did, but I don't. Alexander gripped the steering wheel tighter, emotion threatening to overwhelm him. That's a start, he managed to say. Martha and Oliver were waiting on the porch, relief washing over their faces as Ethan stepped out of the car. Oliver ran to his brother, punching him lightly on the arm before hugging him fiercely. Don't ever do that again, stupid, he muttered. Ethan rolled his eyes but returned the hug. Martha embraced him next, holding him tight before stepping back, to examine him as if ensuring he was really okay. I'm sorry, Ethan said, his eyes on the ground. Martha sighed, ruffling his hair. Let's get you inside. You must be starving. As they turned to go in, Ethan paused, looking back at Alexander, who was still standing by the car. Are you coming? He asked. Such a simple question, yet it meant everything. Alexander nodded, his heart lightening for the first time in what felt like years. Inside, Martha heated up dinner while the boys washed up. When they all gathered around the table, there was a new feeling in the air, something tentative but hopeful. Oliver chattered away as usual, but Ethan was different. He still wasn't talking much, but the wall around him had lowered. Once, he even looked directly at Alexander and smiled. A brief, fleeting thing, but real. Later, as Alexander was leaving, Ethan walked him to the door. You're coming to our game on Saturday, right? He asked, trying to sound casual. Wouldn't miss it, Alexander replied. Ethan nodded, satisfied. Good. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't the kind of warm, open relationship Alexander dreamed of having with his sons. But it was a beginning, and for now that was enough. 2 weeks after the runaway incident, Alexander found himself sitting in an uncomfortable folding chair in the school auditorium, a printed program clutched in his hand. The elementary school's annual spring production was a big event, according to Martha, who sat beside him wearing her Sunday best. Oliver has been practicing his lines nonstop, she whispered as they waited for the show to begin. He's only got 2 scenes, but you'd think he was the star the way he's been carrying on. Alexander smiled, a warm feeling spreading through his chest. These were the moments he had missed, the ordinary, everyday milestones that made up a childhood. He glanced down at the program, finding Oliver's name listed as townsperson number 3 and Ethan's as stage crew. "Ethan didn't want to be in it?" he asked. Martha shook her head. "Never has. He prefers working behind the scenes. He helps with the sets and the lighting. Says he gets too nervous in front of crowds." Alexander nodded, filing away this new piece of information about his son. Every day he learned something new. Ethan's preference for chocolate over vanilla, his fear of heights, his talent for drawing. Each detail was precious, a small piece of the puzzle he was slowly assembling. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. The principal stepped onto the stage to welcome everyone, but Alexander was barely listening. His eyes were scanning the wings where he spotted Ethan dressed in all black, headset on, intently focused on whatever task he had been assigned. The play itself was a charming mess of forgotten lines, backdrop, mishaps, and earnest performances. When Oliver made his entrance, face-painted, shouting his 2 lines with such enthusiasm that some parents chuckled, Alexander felt an unexpected surge of pride. That was his son up there, embodying the fearlessness of childhood that Alexander himself had forgotten somewhere along the way. Halfway through the first act, Alexander noticed Ethan making hand signals to someone in the lighting booth. The boy moved with confidence, completely in his element. Alexander realized he was watching a different side of Ethan, not the guarded, hurt child he usually saw, but a capable young person with skills and passions of his own. When the play ended and the lights came up, the audience applauded as the children took their bows. Even from a distance, Alexander could see Oliver beaming, his eyes searching the crowd until he spotted Alexander and Martha. He waved enthusiastically, and Alexander waved back, smiling broadly. As the crowd began to disperse, they made their way to the side of the stage where the children were gathered. Oliver bounded over, still in costume, his face paint smudged. "Did you see me? Did you hear my lines? I said them just like we practiced," he exclaimed. "You were fantastic," Alexander assured him, resisting the urge to wipe a smear of paint from the boy's chin. A natural talent. Oliver grinned, then turned as Ethan approached, headset now hanging around his neck. "The lights were messed up in the forest scene," he said to Oliver, then glanced at Alexander and Martha. "But I fixed it. Nobody noticed." "I was watching you work," Alexander said. "You seemed to know exactly what you were doing." Ethan shrugged, but Alexander could see he was pleased by the observation. "It's not that hard. Ms. Peterson taught me how the systems work." "He's being modest," a woman's voice chimed in. A tall teacher with kind eyes approached, smiling at Ethan. "Your son has a real knack for technical theater. Best stage manager I've had in years." "Your son." The word sent a ripple of emotion through Alexander. "Ms. Peterson, this is Alexander," Ethan said, stumbling slightly over how to introduce him. "Pleasure to meet you," the teacher said, offering her hand. "We've heard so much about you these past few weeks." Alexander shook her hand, surprised. Ethan had been talking about him at school? As they gathered their things and headed for the exit, Alexander noticed Ethan walking slightly closer to him than usual. Progress was coming in small increments, each one precious. "You know," Alexander said casually as they reached the parking light tour, "I was thinking about getting tickets to the new science exhibit at the museum this weekend. They have a whole section on space exploration." Ethan looked up, a flicker of interest in his eyes. "Really? Really? I thought maybe you two might want to come." "Martha too, of course," he added quickly, glancing at her. Martha smiled knowingly. "I think I'll sit this one out. My old knees can't handle all that walking. But you boys go ahead." Oliver bounced excitedly. "Can we? Please?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, that sounds cool." Alexander smiled, trying not to show just how much that simple acceptance meant to him. "Great, it's a date." As he drove home that night, he found himself replaying the evening in his mind. Oliver's enthusiastic performance, Ethan's quiet competence, the way both boys had looked at him with something that, if not quite love, was at least no longer suspicion. For the first time since discovering he was a father, Alexander began to believe that they might actually become a family. The Willis Tower stood like a sentinel against the Chicago skyline, its black exterior reflecting the morning sun. Alexander led his sons through the impressive lobby, nodding at security guards who looked momentarily surprised to see him with children in tow. "You work all the way up there?" Oliver asked, craning his neck to look up at the seemingly endless building. "The 43rd floor," Alexander replied, guiding them toward a private elevator. "Not quite at the top, but high enough to see the whole city." Ethan remained quiet, hands in his pockets, but his eyes darted around, taking in every detail. Alexander had noticed this about him. He observed everything, processed it internally before deciding how to react. The elevator ride was a source of excitement for Oliver, who watched the numbers climb with wide-eyed wonder. Ethan pressed himself against the glass wall, looking out at the shrinking city below. "Your office is bigger than our whole apartment," Oliver gasped when they finally stepped into Alexander's executive suite. Alexander felt a twist of discomfort at the comment, a reminder of the vastly different circumstances they had lived in. While he had been accumulating wealth and luxury, Rebecca had been raising their children in modest conditions. Karen, his assistant, looked up from her desk, poorly concealing her surprise. "Mr. Blackwood, I didn't realize you were bringing guests today." "Karen, these are my sons, Ethan and Oliver," Alexander said, the words still feeling new on his tongue. "Boys, this is Ms. Karen. She's the one who really runs this place." Karen's expression softened immediately. "It's wonderful to meet you both. Your father talks about you all the time." Oliver beamed, while Ethan looked at Alexander with mild surprise. "Would you like some hot chocolate?" Karen asked. "I happen to have some packets in my drawer for special occasions." "Yes, please," Oliver said immediately. Ethan nodded. "Thank you." Alexander showed them around the office, the conference room, with its sweeping views, the trading floor where analysts tracked real estate markets, the small kitchen where executives gathered for coffee. He explained his work in simple terms, surprising himself with how trivial it suddenly seemed compared to the importance of the two boys walking beside him. In his personal office, Oliver immediately claimed the big leather chair, spinning around with delight. Ethan wandered to the windows, looking out at the city. "Is that the lake?" he asked, pointing east. Alexander joined him. "Yes. On clear days like today, you can see all the way to Michigan." Ethan studied the view thoughtfully. "Mom used to take us to the beach there in summer." These moments, when Ethan shared memories of Rebecca, had become more frequent. Alexander treasured each one, painful as they sometimes were. They were glimpses into the life his sons had lived without him. "She loved the water," Alexander said, softly. "We used to—" His phone rang, interrupting the moment. Karen's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Blackwood, Mr. Chen is on line 1. He says it's urgent about the Riverside project." Alexander frowned. James Chen was a significant investor, and the Riverside development was their biggest current project, a $200 million commercial complex. "If there was a problem, tell him I'll call him back in an hour," Alexander said after a brief hesitation. "He was quite insistent, sir. Said the zoning commission is meeting right now and they need an immediate decision." Alexander looked at his sons. Oliver had found a paperweight and was examining it curiously. Ethan was watching him, his expression unreadable. "You should take it," Ethan said quietly. "It sounds important." "This is important too," Alexander replied, gesturing between them. Ethan shrugged. "We can wait." Alexander studied his son's face, reading the expectation there. That business would come first, as it probably always had. That's what Ethan was used to, what he anticipated, what Rebecca had likely experienced time and again. "Karen," Alexander said firmly, "tell Mr. Chen that I'm unavailable and will call him within the hour. Jason can handle the zoning issue. He's been briefed on all the contingencies." "Yes, sir," she replied, a note of surprise in her voice. Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly, the only indication of his reaction. "Now," Alexander said, turning back to his sons with a smile. "Who's hungry? There's a great pizza place on the ground." "Floor," Oliver cheered, already racing toward the door. Ethan lingered for a moment, his gaze moving from the phone to Alexander. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. Alexander placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Yes, I did." Something shifted in Ethan's expression then, a small softening around the eyes, the barest hint of a smile. He didn't say anything more, but as they walked to the elevator, he fell into step beside Alexander rather than trailing behind. Later, as they sat in the restaurant sharing an enormous deep-dish pizza, Oliver peppered Alexander with questions about his work. Ethan remained quieter, but he was listening intently, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions about how real estate development worked. "So basically," Ethan said, piecing it together, "you buy old buildings and land and then make them into something new that people want." Alexander nodded, impressed. "That's exactly right. It's about seeing potential, where others might not." Ethan took a bite of pizza, chewing thoughtfully. "Is that why you came looking for us, because you saw potential?" The question caught Alexander off guard. He set down his slice, meeting Ethan's gaze directly. "No," he said firmly. "I came looking for you because you're my sons. Because from the moment I knew you existed, nothing else mattered as much." Alexander stood in his apartment kitchen, a recipe for chocolate cake open on his tablet, flour dusting his usually immaculate countertops. Martha had mentioned casually that the boy's birthday was approaching, their first without Rebecca, and the realization had hit him like a physical blow. Another milestone he had missed, year after year. But not this one. This time, he would be there. The cake was ambitious for someone who rarely cooked, but he was determined to make it himself rather than ordering from a bakery. He wanted it to be personal, even if it wasn't perfect. His phone chimed with a text from Martha. "Don't forget they're coming at 4. Ethan's soccer practice runs until 3:30. Alexander smiled. In the 2 months since the museum incident, a new routine had developed. The boys still lived with Martha, but they spent weekends and several evenings a week with him. It wasn't ideal, but it was working. A gradual transition that gave everyone time to adjust. As he mixed the batter, his mind drifted to the small box sitting on his desk, Rebecca's journals, which Martha had reluctantly given him last week. She kept these from the time she found out she was pregnant, Martha had explained. "I wasn't sure if I should give them to you, but I think you need to understand what those years were like for her." Alexander had only read a few entries so far, each one leaving him emotionally drained. Rebecca's joy at discovering she was having twins, her fear about raising them alone, her determination to give them a good life despite financial struggles, her occasional moments of despair, wondering if she had made the right choice in not telling him about the pregnancy. The most difficult passages were the ones where she wrote about him, sometimes with anger, sometimes with lingering affection, but always with a sense that she was protecting the boys from inevitable disappointment. They asked about their father today. One entry read, "I showed them a photo of Alexander. Oliver said he looked nice. Ethan asked why he doesn't visit us. I didn't know what to say. How do I tell them that their father doesn't even know they exist because I was too proud, too hurt to tell him? Am I being selfish, keeping them from him? Or am I protecting them from a man who always put work before everything else?" The words had haunted Alexander for days. A timer jolted him back to the present. He carefully removed the cake pans from the oven, the rich chocolate aroma filling the kitchen. As he set them to cool, he heard the elevator chime signaling an arrival. Martha appeared first, laden with wrapped presents. Behind her came Oliver, chattering excitedly, and Ethan, who stopped short at the sight of the flour-covered kitchen. "You made a cake?" he asked, surprised. Alexander nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "Tried to, anyway. It might be a disaster." Ethan approached the counter, inspecting the cooling cakes with a critical eye. "Mom always made chocolate cake for our birthday, too." "I know," Alexander said softly. "Martha told me it was your favorite." Oliver was already exploring the apartment, looking for hidden presents. "Where are the gifts?" he called from the living room. Patience, Martha admonished, though her eyes twinkled. Let's have cake first. The afternoon unfolded in a way Alexander could never have imagined a few months ago. The four of them around his dining table singing happy birthday, the boys blowing out candles and opening presents. The cake was lopsided but delicious, and Oliver declared it almost as good as Mom's. As the celebration wound down, Alexander cleared his throat nervously. I have one more thing for you both, he said, retrieving a small wrapped package from his office. The boys exchanged curious glances as he placed it on the table. What is it? Oliver asked, always the first to speak. Alexander hesitated. It's something I found in your mother's things. Something I think she would want you to have now. Ethan's expression grew serious as he carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a small wooden box with their names carved on top. Inside were two identical watches, simple but elegant timepieces with brown leather straps. I don't understand, Ethan said, looking confused. Alexander took a deep breath. Your mother bought these for you for this birthday. She had them engraved and everything. He gently turned one over to show the inscription on the back. Time reveals who truly stays. Love always, Mom. Oliver's eyes widened. How did you know? She wrote about it, Alexander explained. In her journal. She bought them months ago before she got too sick. She wanted you to have them when you turned 13. Tears welled in Oliver's eyes as he picked up one of the watches, carefully putting it on his wrist. Ethan remained still, staring at the remaining watch, his fingers tracing the inscription. She knew she wouldn't be here, he said quietly, the realization dawning in his young face. Alexander nodded, his own eyes burning. She wanted to make sure you knew she was thinking of you, planning for you, even when she couldn't be with you anymore. Ethan looked up, his expression raw with emotion. Thank you, he whispered. Then, after a moment's hesitation, Dad. The word hung in the air, simple yet monumental. Alexander's heart seemed to stop, then race forward. It was the first time Ethan had called him that, a single syllable that bridged the chasm between them. Martha wiped away a tear, smiling through her emotion. Oliver, less reserved as always, threw his arms around Alexander. This is the best birthday ever, he declared. Ethan didn't join the hug, but he met Alexander's gaze and nodded, a silent acknowledgement that something fundamental had changed between them. As he slipped on the watch, aligning it carefully on his wrist, Alexander knew they had turned a corner. They were becoming a family. 6 months to the day since Alexander had first seen his sons at Rebecca's grave, they stood there again. The cemetery looked different now, green and vibrant under the summer sun rather than barren and cold. The three of them formed a small semicircle around the headstone, each holding a single white lily, Rebecca's favorite. So much had changed in those 6 months. The boys now lived with Alexander during the week, spending weekends with Martha, who had become more like a grandmother to them. His sprawling penthouse, once a showcase of solitary success, now bore evidence of teenage occupation, sports equipment, scattered in corners, textbooks on the coffee table, family photos replacing abstract art on the walls. Alexander had restructured his entire company, delegating most of his responsibilities to allow him to be home by dinner every night. He hadn't missed a single soccer game, school event, or parent-teacher conference. The empire he had spent his life building now seemed secondary to the family he was nurturing. Oliver placed his flower on the grave first, patting the headstone affectionately as if it were Rebecca herself. Hi, Mom, he said. We miss you a lot, but we're doing okay. Alexander went next, laying his lily beside Oliver's. Thank you, he whispered, too quietly for the boys to hear. For them, for everything. Ethan was last, carefully positioning his flower between the others. He stood silent for a long moment, his fingers brushing against the watch on his wrist, the one Rebecca had chosen for him. I think she'd be happy, he said finally, glancing at Alexander. Seeing us together like this. Alexander's throat tightened with emotion. I hope so. She would, Ethan said with quiet certainty. She wrote about you, in her letters to us. She said you were a good man who just got lost for a while." Alexander swallowed hard, unable to speak. Ethan continued, his voice steady. "I was so angry when I first met you. I thought you abandoned us, but now I understand it wasn't that simple." He paused. "I think Mom would be proud of you." The words washed over Alexander like a benediction. Coming from Ethan, skeptical, guarded Ethan who had resisted him at every turn, they meant everything. "I think she'd be most proud of you," Alexander replied. "Both of you. You're exceptional. Young men. I'm lucky to be your father." Oliver smiled, but it was Ethan's reaction Alexander watched for. The boy nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We should go," Ethan said after a moment. "We promised Martha we'd be at her place for dinner by 6. As they walked away from the grave, Oliver ran ahead, always in motion. Ethan fell into step beside Alexander, closer than before. "Dad?" he said, testing the word that was becoming more natural each time he used it. "Yes? I'm glad you found us." Alexander looked at his son, this miraculous blend of himself and Rebecca, this young person who had faced so much loss yet remained strong, and felt a love so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "So am I," he said simply. "More than you'll ever know." Together they walked toward the future neither had imagined 6 months ago, but both now embraced. A family forged through pain but bound by something stronger. The promise of tomorrow, together.